I must start with a brief introduction about the challenges this modern day and age pose to Poiskei Halacha. We are dealing with a topic Shelo Sha'arum Avotenu. Previous generations didn't deal with the sugya. They couldn't deal with the sugya. They couldn't even imagine that these questions will come up. And we are living in an age in which there will be so many questions in which we have almost no precedents and no sources. And the bigger challenge is the fundamental axiom, which should be so simple to every sensible person, every sensible poisik, does not seem to be so simple, which means you cannot write a tshuva if you don't understand the shaila. And you cannot give an opinion if you don't really know what is the sugya we're dealing with. So before you give a response, you need to understand clearly and define clearly what are the issues, what are the shailas we are dealing with. So in recent years, various questions came up and many tshuvas were written which really don't really relate to the question. And I want to bring a few examples of the recent past, of the more distant past, and questions that will come up in the very near future. Megaphones, microphones, hearing aids. So everybody agrees you can't use a microphone on Shabbos. And I think microphones on Shabbos are one of the defining factors between Reform and conservative shuls and Orthodox shuls. Any Rav that will have a microphone in his shul, hoitzi atzmai min haklal. Fundamentally, technologically, there's no difference between a hearing aid and a microphone. They both do the same exactly. There's a membrane and galei kol, or sound waves, cause the membrane to react. And then the sound waves are transformed or transmitted to electromagnetic signals. And we reproduce a voice that is similar to the human voice. Reb Moshe wrote a tshuva about Mikra, Megillah, with a megaphone, with a microphone. So Reb Moshe doesn't speak about Shabbos, goes without saying you can't use a microphone on Shabbos. It's an electrical device. But Reb Moshe does lean and to say that you could be Yotzei Mikra Megillah. Reb Moshe understood that a microphone magnifies the human voice. You're actually hearing the human voice, but you're hearing it louder. Until Reb Shlomo Zalman came along, and in Mincha Shlomo Siman Zayin, Reb Shlomo Zalman actually did some fundamental research. And I actually know from his family that he spoke to Professor Yuval Ne'eman. Yuval Ne'eman was a very world-renowned physicist and an Israeli scientist. And Reb Shlomo Zalman called him over. He didn't really need to talk to a world-famous scientist, physicist, to just understand the fundamentals of what electricity is and how microphones work. But he taught us such a fundamental axiom: you can't give an answer until you thoroughly understand what is the shaila and what are we dealing with. So it is clear that when you use a microphone, you're not hearing the human voice. you're hearing a reproduction that is similar to the human voice. But this is a totally new voice in which you have a maklet and a mashder. And maybe I don't have the right terms in English. A transmitter and I'm not sure I have the right words. The Chazon Ish and Reb Moshe didn't really understand how microphones work. Reb Shlomo Zalman did. Now, maybe at another opportunity, I do not remember in the more than 5 years that we're learning together, did we have a shiur about Shomea Koina? And I have an amazing new approach to explain Shomea Koina. And I want to be miyashiv, the fundamental feeling of the Chazon Ish Reb Moshe, but that has nothing to do with our sugya. I just bring one example that goes back decades. You need to understand the shaila if you want to give a real sensible tshuva. Cochlear implants, is that considered that the person hears? So when we're dealing with microphones and with normal hearing aids, what the person is hearing is a reproduction, a totally artificial reproduction of the human voice. He's not hearing the human voice. The human voice is not magnified. It's not made louder. It is totally reproduced. With a cochlear implant, the question is, how do we define hearing? Cochlear implant just skips the inner ear and it goes to the brain. How do we define hearing? We are on the verge of a new age of bionics. And in this present war, so many young soldiers lost limbs. We spoke about this in the past, the many shilas that I dealt with wonderful young, from dedicated soldiers that now have artificial arms. And as of now, these limbs are computer operated. We are on the verge of amazing breakthroughs in which we will have bionic arms that connect directly to the central nervous system, to the human nervous system. And they will get commands from the nervous system and not from computers. Would that change various different halachas? Would it be mutar to use these limbs on Shabbos? We are very close to a situation in which you activate systems with your thought. So everybody knows Siri and Alexa. So in modern homes, you just need to talk and you're going to activate systems. But in the near future, probably, one could never foresee. But it is likely that in the near future, we will be able to activate systems just by thought. And so in so many different areas, we are living in a changing world, and changes come very fast in our day and age. And we will have many shilas and halacha. And the first challenge will be just deciding what are the shilas, what are we dealing with. And Rabbanim will need to understand far more about science and technology than they did in the past. So what Reb Moshe and Reb Shlomo Zalman had to deal with was electricity. And compared to what we will need to deal with in our day and age, that is like baby talk, understanding electricity. We are dealing with microelectronics and so many different technologies. What does it all have to do with the sugya we will be discussing today, which is cultured meat? And maybe some of the definitions I will be using, I'm not so thoroughly familiar with the scientific terms in English, because most of the tshuvas I wrote in this sugya were written in Lashon Kodesh. But we will try to be sensible. So cultured meat, in which we take cells, stem cells, embryonic cells, And there are different approaches, different ideas. What are the basic cells we are dealing with? Are they embryonic cells? Are they stem cells taken from the umbilical cord or from the placenta or from more developed tissue or actually from, embryos or even pre-embryonic stage? But we are taking fundamental cells and developing them in a scaffold. So in Lashon Kodesh, in Ivrit, it's called matzah gidul. I think the English term would be a scaffold. And trying to imitate the human body or imitate biology and the way human cells or animal cells, meat cells develop. And we will make these cells duplicate, multiply, and develop at a rapid pace and try to produce meat. So many of the tshuvas written, in my opinion, just didn't get it, and didn't understand what are the shaylas we need to deal with. So many tshuvas are written about bittul beroiv. And if we deal with bittul beroiv, are the fundamental sense bottle in what develops later, brings us to a vast array of questions that are related to bittul beroiv. Mamid, in the few moments I listened to Reb Shlomo until he realized that I'm online, and I always like to listen from behind the door incognito, just to get a glimpse of what is being discussed. I think Reb Shlomo dealt with the concepts of mamid, of tam. So if we're dealing with bittul beroiv, then one of the sugis to be discussed is mamid. Mamid means that what gives power and what gives development to the teroibis is never bottle. That is what it keeps it all together. And then we need to deal with the question of ein mevatlen isalachatchila. But in my opinion, our question has nothing to do with bittul beroiv. Bittul beroiv is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the sugya we're dealing with. Some Rabbanim wrote, the fundamental cells are microscopic. Can't even see them. And the hiyoımhashchor and many other poskim going back more than 100 years write that little microcosms that are not visible to the naked eye are as if non-existent. And therefore there would be no isur of teloim. If these teloim are so small that they're microscopic, or even if the naked eye could see something, but it doesn't have the tzura of a living organism, it just looks like a speck of dust or a little grain of sand, then there is no isur teloim. And many Rabbanim wrote about our sugya, cultured meat, dealing with the questions, the fundamental cells are microscopic, you can't see them, so maybe there's no isur at all. Once again, that's not our sugya. That's not our topic. And to me, as I wrote in the very first shuva years ago, I think I wrote this shuva to Rabbi Genak from the OU, our fundamental question is, how do we define meat? Meat that was brought to be, not by a natural process, not by natural growth, of an embryo developing into a fetus, and a fetus developing into a born animal, but rather meat that was produced in a laboratory. How do we define, is that meat? Is it basar b'cholov? Does it relate to the species from which the fundamental cells were taken? I think that is the fundamental question. And therefore, we're not dealing with bittul beroiv. Because if we would assume that only the fundamental cells are meat, and everything that develops from them is new, is heter and not isur, that would be the question of bittul beroiv. But I think that is a mistaken assumption. It is not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a fixed product, with a finished product, and not with the fundamental cells which we use to develop this product. And therefore, it has nothing to do with the sugya of Masha Einoi Nera La'ayin, because our question is not about the stem cells or the embryonic cells which we used to develop this product, but about the product itself. So how do we define meat? So meat that has come to be. Are we connected, my friends? Because suddenly my screen is dark.
We are connected. We see the Rav perfectly, and we hear you perfectly.
Okay. So the questions are twofold or manyfold, and not only twofold. How do we relate to meat that came to be not by a natural biological process, but in a laboratory? When HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the wisdom, the ability to imitate Masa Bereshis, to imitate nature, and to bring fundamental cells to reproduce, to multiply, and to bring forward something that resembles meat. In this sugya, I wrote 6 tshuvas, and the tshuvas follow the development of the product. As in so many different areas of scientific research, sometimes the result is disappointing. And our expectations were different than the result. And the result does not live up to our expectations. And therefore, the very early tshuvas I wrote about the sugya have become irrelevant as the research moved forward and developed. They were not successful in producing a product that actually looks like meat, tastes like meat, has the fabric and characteristics of meat. They did make some progress, but not as expected. And we will deal with 3 different types of products. One, the original thought, which one company worked on, and Israel is in the forefront of this research, as in many other areas, use actually meat from cows or other animals. The other company uses poultry, which is oif, which has less questions because we're only using kosher animals. And the third product actually takes cells out of an egg and not a bird or an animal, which narrows down the shyness, because the fundamental cells are not fleshy. They're taken out of an egg and not of an animal, whether a bird or a cow. So as we develop this sugya, we will touch upon the different questions. So in the very first tshuvas I wrote, I dealt at great length with serum. Serum is a blood product. And at the first stages of developing cultured meat, the fundamental cells were put into serum. That they no longer do that. So a very fascinating halachic discussion that I wrote, it still will be printed in my sefer because it's a fascinating halachic discussion, but it is no longer relevant. So we're going to skip that. So the way I see it, the fundamental question was, and might still be, what looks like meat, tastes like meat, smells like meat, and in a laboratory would be defined as meat. However, it was produced in a total artificial way, not grown in an animal's uterus, in an animal's womb, and not grown as a living organism. Would that be defined as meat? I assumed there's a saying, if it walks like a duck and looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, obviously it's a duck. But maybe in this modern world, that is not true. Might look like a duck, smell like a duck, taste like a duck. Maybe it's not a duck. That is our question. And I assumed, to me it was a milsa de pshita, that meat is meat. And it doesn't matter at all where it comes from, where it's going. If you examine it in a laboratory under the microscope and it's meat, dinai kebosa b'chol davar. However, the Chazon Ish seems to have a different opinion. And anybody that knows me and the Torah that I teach, I so much revere and not only admire the Chazon Ish. I tell my Talmidim, to me the Chazon Ish was like one of the Rishonim. And I want to quote a Chazon Ish in Yerodei in Kuf Yud. Happens to be in Hilchos Nida. And the Chazon Ish deals with Tumas Leida. And I'm just going to read 3 lines. Siman Kuf Yud, Chazon Ish Yerodei. I don't know whether you have it on the screen, because I think the Chazon Ish is not in most of the Oitzer HaChachma and other platforms. Reb Shlomo, do you think we could fetch the Chazon Ish? I'm not sure. I don't think
I think we can. Rabbi Eliezer, can we get to Chazon Ish? I'm going to give you the site again. You actually sent me that site. Chazon Ish is, I can,
Siman Kuf Yud Yerodei. If we can't have it on the screen, I'll just quote the Chazon Ish. It's just 2 or 3 lines. It'll be beneficial if we can see.
I'm going to send a picture of it to Rabbi Eliezer, and he'll put it on the screen.
Okay. So for the time being, I'm quoting the Chazon Ish. Nera, de kol dinoi basar, ein dinam talui betchunas chomaram vetzuratam. When we define basar, it doesn't depend on the nature of the chomer. Ve'im nivra chaticha shel basar, if we could create a piece of meat, einena nevela, velo eina zvucha, ve'efshar demuteres av b'chalav. If we could create a piece of meat, and it'll be totally similar to natural meat, it will not be nevela, no chiyuv shchita, ve'efshar demuteres av b'chalav. It is noteworthy that the Chazon Ish writes efshar. Elo kol dinay habosar ubebosar hachayim. It needs to come from a living organism. Ulefi zeh im hepila chadicha. If an animal had a nefel, which means an aborted pregnancy, im hepila chaticha, kivin she'ena lachaticha teres hachayim, hoyo lanu lahatira ba'achila, bein shel isha, bein shel tmeya, bein shel ta'ira, aval ein adin kain.
We have it on the screen. We have it on the screen, Klisheni. Starts on
okay, great. Oh, great. It's second line, second paragraph.
Near the kol dinay basar.
Nera the kol dinay basar. Ein dinam.
No, you went too far.
You went too far.
Near the line.
Here we are. Kol dinay basar. Ein dinam tori betchunas achomerim v'tzurasam. Ve'im nivro chaticha shel basar einena nevela. You could underline it, Pesach. V'lo ein zvicha. Ve'efshar demuteres av b'chalav. Ela kol dinay basar ubebasar hachayim. Bebasar bu min hachai. Ve'im hepila chaticha shel basar. אף אגב דאין על החתיכה תרס חיים מצד עצמו, יש תרס חיים של, he doesn't quote the Chazon Ish actually with the original sprach of the Chazon Ish, but it's quite accurate.
Zel Shainai. It seems he's right. Zel Shainai. I don't know.
It's not exactly Zlosha because I'm sitting with the Chazon Ish, but it's quite accurate. It's okay.
Okay.
So what do I say? I humbly say, I disagree with the Chazon Ish. And let me just note, the Chazon Ish didn't need to deal with these questions because once again, he's talking theory. All he means to explain is that a nafel, I don't know how a nafel is defined in English, an aborted fetus, still has a din of Toras Chaim because it is potential life. And when this fetus started developing, it had life. It had the life of the mother, of the animal in which it developed. And therefore, it has a din of basar. So when the Chazon Ish writes his fundamental axiom or assumption, there was no halacha l'maaseh. It didn't occur to him that this has any relevance halacha l'maaseh. He just means to explain why an aborted fetus, a nafel, does have a din basar, even though we would assume that basar is only coming from life. Here we are. Okay. But we already saw the Chazon Ish, right? But we could go over it again. So at the beginning of Siman Kuf Yud, Kol din basar ein dinam toli betchuna sachoim elem mitzurasam. Im nivro chaticha shel basar einena nevela v'lo ein zvicha v'esh lo mesav b'cholav. Kol din basar b'basar chayim. ולפי זה, אם מפיל החתיכה, כיוון שאין על החתיכה תורס חיים, הוי לא נטילה בחילה. אבל אין הדין כן. ואף על גב דאין על החתיכה תורס חיים מצד עצמו, יש לו תורס החיים של אימו. So all the Chazon Ish means to explain is, we assume that artificial basar is not basar, even though it has the characteristics of meat. Chemically, it is meat. Biologically, it's meat. But if it doesn't come from life, doesn't have a din of basar. Maperes chaticha comes from life. So I humbly say once again, in my opinion, meat is meat. And it doesn't matter how it came to be. And I have two Gemaras. And I think those Gemaras clearly prove my point. Shelo kedivrei Chazon Ish. Menachos samach tes amid beis. So Mesechet Menachos samach tes amid beis, there is an avoya. Chitin sheyodi ba'ovim. Mahem lemenachos. Could we have Menachos samach tes on the screen?
Let's put the Gemara, Menachos samach tes.
Samach tes amid beis Mesechet.
And then we'll need the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Nafnan tes, yes?
More in Sanhedrin, Nun tes amud beis. So these are two fundamental Gemaras. Both deal.
We have it in the original package, Pesach, and it's an original package on page 11. You can put it up there, and underneath is the Rav's tshuva from Pei Beis. Page 11 on our package.
Chitin shiyordu ba'ovin, mahem lemenachos.
Right smack in the middle of the Omid.
In the middle of the Omid. Boy Reb Zera, chitin shiyordu ba'ovim, mahu lemai. Ila menachos, amai loi. אלא לשתי הלחם. ממויס וסייכם אומר רחמון אל הפוקה, דחוץ לארץ דלו, אבל דאובים שפי דומי, אוי דיל ממויס וסייכם דווקא. So first of all, let us understand, how does grain come down from the clouds? Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi writes, Yordu ba'ovim, imamoto, kisheshoso ha'ovim ba'okiyanos, boros vina malei achitin, which is a bit far-fetched. So we know that water evaporates. And water evaporates, and it turns into gas or steam, and that is how clouds develop. And then clouds give us water again. So Rashi writes that the clouds sucked up a boat full of grain, which is not very likely to happen. Let's have a look at Tosfos. Chitin Shiur the Bovin Perish Bekenderish Shosel Bepianis Bebolus Fino. Malay Chitin Vekosher Benutam Dim Chutzlorz Vechiyut L'Shtei Lechem Bishvil Shayu Bavim Makol Makom Meshazeka Meinu Veneka. Narrowly, Dali Dei Neis Yodu Ba'ovim Ki Hana Atmasa the Mesechet Sanhedrin. So Tosfos already brings together these two sugyas. So Tosfos' opinion is it was a miracle. And when it rained, grain come down from the clouds. And the question is that Moshe Seichem? And I ask, is it at all defined as grain? Shtei Lechem needs to be chito. That's grain. This grain didn't grow. It's not Gedula Karka. It's miraculous. And the entire question of the Gemara is Moshe Seichem. Does Moshe Seichem necessitate what grows in Eretz Yisrael, or it just comes to disqualify what grew in Chutz La'aretz? But the Gemara doesn't for a moment question, is that grain? If it looks like grain, tastes like grain, smells like grain, it's grain. So this seems to be a fundamental milta de pshita, which brings us to Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Tes. Reb Shimon ben Chalafta is walking, I don't know where, in the savannah, and lions pounce upon him, and his life is in mortal danger. Sanhedrin Nun Tes Amid Beis. And then a miracle occurs, and two huge chunks of meat fall out of the sky, and the lions jumped upon those meat and devoured the meat, and they were satisfied, and they left him alone. Do we have on the screen Sanhedrin Nun Tes Amid Beis? Some of the meat was left after the lions moved away. Was Titayida Talmid Chochem? That Shimon Mechalafta thinks to himself, it's on the bottom of the page. Here we are. Reb Shimon Mechalafta v'ko'ozel ba'orcha, poga behana ariyevosa, the havakuna amela ape. They were roaring. Omer, akfilim shurgan teref, lifted his eyes to the heavens. Nachis tarta atmasa, chad achlu v'chad shavko. So Reb Shimon Chalafta thinks to himself, Kodesh Baruch Hu knows everything in advance. So why did two chunks of meat come down if the lions only ate one? What am I supposed to do with the other? This would be an interesting discussion in the Beis Medrash. So it picks up that piece of meat, v'osel bei midrasha. Boyala, is this permissible for consumption? Could we eat this? It's a chunk of meat that fell out of the sky. Is it mutar also? In the heavens there are no dvorim tmeim. And what if a donkey came tumbling out of the heavens? Would we say it's kosher? Just an interesting comment. I don't know whether it's relevant at all. The Gemara in Menachos is Boyer Reb Zera. And here it's once again Boyer Meneh Reb Zera. Was it Reb Zera having this vivid imagination? Trying to imagine things and ask questions? Both sugyas, it's Reb Zera. Boyer Reb Zera Merebavu, Yodeloi de Muschamamai, Omeloi, Yored Nala. Rashi says, oh, that's a harsh expression. He tell him, you're an idiot. Who omelei? You already heard. Ein dover tome yored min hashamayim. So Rashi says, it is impossible that a donkey will come down from the heavens. And if it will happen, it's going to be a kosher donkey. That's what Rashi says at the bottom of the page. Yored nala, tanen shoyto. Ein dover tome yored min hashamayim. Dover she'enoyu. V'im yeshnoi toru. So what was the question? Is this at all meat? Is it at all meat? Is the donkey a donkey? Looks like a donkey. Didn't come from a living animal. Just fell out of the sky. So I don't think the Gemara means a donkey came out of the sky and started running around. The lashon of the Gemara is Yordeloi Dumus Chamor. But in the story of Reb Shimon Mechalafta was 2 chunks of meat. It wasn't a living animal. That meat didn't come from a living animal. It's just meat. And nevertheless, they ask, is it nevela or is it not nevela? Is it a mean toyer or a mean tome? But it's meat. If it looks like meat, tastes like meat, then it's meat. So these 2 Gemaras prove my point. The Achronim deal with a similar question regarding Ner Chanukah. So they lit the menorah 8 days. Did that oil come from olives? No. Only a little bit of that oil came from olives. The other is just miracle oil. And after pikel it's kosher lemenuchas. Only shemen zayis, kosher lahadlokah. And that is why my pushet assumption is meat is meat. And doesn't matter how it came to be. And there would be no difference between miraculous meat or miraculous grain or meat or grain that will be produced in a laboratory. So that was assumption number 1. And it does go against the Chazon Ish. But once again, I don't know how the Chazon Ish will deal with these Gemaras. So definitely we cannot be makel based on the Chazon Ish because the Chazon Ish wasn't written halacha l'maaseh. Didn't occur to him that this will ever be halacha l'maaseh, the question. So this is assumption number 1. So to me, it's a milsa de pshita that there is a isra of basa b'cholov. And this is different than taking eggplant and trying to make it taste like liver. Under a microscope, it'll be obvious that this is eggplant. It is a veg and not meat. Masha enken cultured meat, which was supposed to be meat. And therefore, in my opinion, it's not about bittul berav. It's not about microscopic organisms. What it boils down to is a very simple question: how we define meat. And this is a disagreement that I have with the Chazon Ish. So this is number 1. So I wrote milta de pshita that it's also babasa b'cholov. And it's also poshet to me that you need to take the cells only of a kosher animal. If it's not a kosher animal, then the meat that you would produce would be donkey meat, it would be camel meat, it would be the same meat as where the cells came from. Question number 3 we had to deal with is, do the cells need to be taken from an animal achar shchita? Would there be an issa nevela? And that is somewhat more of a tricky question. It is easier to define meat than to define species. It is easier to define species than to answer the question, do the cells need to be taken from an animal that we did shchita on? Because if we want to use embryonic cells, we're using an embryo. And we're taking the embryo out of a living cow, not a dead cow. La'achar shchita. Would there be a problem of Avim and Ahai? This is a far trickier question. Because what we're removing are embryonic cells. not an aver. Does this have to do with the question of Obiyerachimoi? So as we try to define the various different questions we are dealing with, things become more complicated. And let me just once again go over question number one. Is it meat? The relevance of this question is in the halacha b'sar b'cholav. To me, poshut kebeis bekutre, it's meat. If grain falling out of the clouds is grain, and meat falling out of the sky is meat, then yes, there is a isur of b'sar b'cholav. Tohor or tamei, that is exactly the question that Shimon ben Chalafta asked. The chunks of meat falling out of the sky were difficult to define. Obviously, couldn't know. Is it horse? Is it cow? What is it? So yes, and therefore I said we could only use cells from a kosher animal. Question number three would be, does it need to be an animal la'achar shchita? Or might it be a chashash of nevela, eva menachai? So that is a trickier question. And as in so many different areas, when we don't have any clear proof from Sugas Hashas, we need to be machmir. So one of the questions in which I had a total disagreement with some other Rabbanim was a sugya in Masechet B'choros. And I don't know how far you went into this sugya. But in Masechet B'choros, there's an interesting sugya about
yes, we have the Yachmor. We have that. We can put it up for the row.
Yes, so let's put it up on the screen. The Gemara in Masechet B'choros. I believe we will go more into an in-depth discussion about that sugya maybe next week. But I would suggest let's just have a fundamental look at the Gemara. Chalad Yachmurta. Savar Rabbanan Ameimer Beyanini Vasiran Omer of Safra Zarada Ayola U the Ozer Bosar Ayalta Va'aida Darach Amatzar Lo Mizdakake Va'ozer Bosar Yachmurta Venatri. So this is very interesting. Rashi writes, Chalad Yachmurta Ke'en Beitzei Zohar Shahayachmur Mutziot Merachaman. In modern Hebrew, the Yachmur is a species of deer. Some argue it's the moose. Other modern, biologists say it's one of the species of deer. And Rashi writes, it is Ke'ein Beitzah Zochar that come out of the uterus of this animal. And in a way, it's like two little balls, somewhat similar to testicles. And the Gemara says it's also Mishameva Menachai, Shenekro Min HaZochor Berechem. And then the Gemara says, no, it is just sperm. And sperm is not an aver. And therefore there would be no Isser. Rabbeinu Chananel, עד שהוא הולך אחריו סויבל בגופו שכבה זרע ומסבשל בגופו הרבה וכשבוע יחמו אותו אגב דנזכר שזה הרבה אינו נבלה בגופו ומוציאו לחוץ עם הראי שלה. So in modern biology we're not aware of this phenomenon, but like many other sugyas in the Gemara, it is not relevant. We deal with the sugyas that we find in the Gemara. And then the Gemara says, Omer Rav Huna, Arabo kaneged ponav shel chamor muter, pirshe ba'almahu. Pirshe ba'alma, there is no isser because it's not ra'ui la'achila. Several Rabbanim argued that our sugya is similar to what we find in this Gemara, and it is Pirsha Ba'alma, and therefore there would be no Isser. And once again, this is a comparison which I think is totally, in Lashon Kodesh we would say, lo la'inyan. As described by Rashi and by Rabbeinu Hananel, it has nothing to do with our sugya. It is the sperm of the male. Sperm that solidified, no longer fluid, but solid. Sperm is not basar. Sperm is pirshe b'alma. It's like urine. If it would be a behemoth tameya, there's the Israel of Yoitzim and Atama. But a yolo is a behemoth tahira. It's not Eva Menachai. Because the Havamina was that it is part of the male's body. And the Gemara says it is not. It is sperm that was transformed from a liquid form, from a fluid form, to a solid form. Sperm, like urine, is pirsha ba'alma, and if it comes from a behemoth tahira, there is no isser. Our question is a totally different question. We are dealing with cells of meat. And as I proved before, the developed cells are also meat. And if they are meat, then we are dealing with the question of Eva Menachai, Nevela, Min Toma V'Tohira. So in my opinion, this entire sugya has nothing to do with our discussion. So I think at this stage, we could stop here. And if you are interested, we could continue the discussion going more in depth and discussing the various changes. Because the original expectation that we could cause these stem cells to develop and to have a product that actually would be totally resemble meat did not come to fruition, at least to the best of my knowledge. And the last time I visited the lab was, I would say, about 8 or 9 months ago, and I'm not aware that there were any fundamental breakthroughs since then.